Hello, my name is Jeremy Cerise, and I'll be reading a chapter from my new book, The Short While. It's a pseudo-sequel to my first book, Curveball, which came out in 2015. The Short While is also science fiction, a kind of half comics, half prose hybrid. To clarify what that means, most of the pages of the book look like this, or also sometimes just a regular page of comics. The Short While is about two men, Paolo and Colin, who accidentally leave a party with one another's nearly identical leather jackets. And then, after they swap them back, go on a date. They see a movie that Paolo unexpectedly starts sobbing in the middle of, and Colin decides to leave before it's over. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. Don't be. I'm the one who feels bad. Everything's 4D now, and this one wasn't, and I can't believe you've already seen me cry. How attractive can that possibly be? Over drinks, they tell one another the story of their lives. They talk about Colin's job, who works as a project manager for an advisory committee regarding public monuments. After the fall of the previous government, colloquially referred to as the administration, Colin's team is now in charge of replacing monuments built in reverence for that more authoritarian government with more gentle contemporary works to help increase tourism. How he was raised by a single mother named Minnie, who had him by way of a donor. How she is a member of the Dance, a self-help pseudo-religion who work together in troops doing community outreach, started by a group of friends who would originally meet after work on evenings when their schedules permitted, to spin in open fields and make out as a way to alleviate stress. They talk about Paolo, who works a series of odd jobs, including but not limited to landscaper, plotline writer for erotic virtual reality experiences, barista at an organic beetle bar, as well as volunteering at his local animal shelter. How Paolo was the third child of two immigrants from the EU, who accidentally and reluctantly had him much later in life. There's a 15-year age gap between Paolo and his older siblings Caroline and Carolina, which meant Paolo's childhood was spent isolated and alone. Caroline and Carolina work as data analysts, specializing in dismantling the large surveillance network created by the administration. Shortly after being hired, his sisters were promoted, and in their new positions, ordered to reinstate this network for the current government. His sisters have two boys each, Corey and Corin and Carl. Both women are now divorced. Paolo talks about how the language and cultural barrier he felt growing up with two much older parents caused him to shrink in his ambition. He flitted between jobs, easily distracted from obtainable goals by loftier, more abstract ones. Because he knew he could never measure up to the expectations of his parents, he felt free to do whatever he wanted, but didn't know what that would be. He made his own way, often by accident. He couldn't remember how he made any of his friends in the city. When those friends invited him to a party thrown by someone one of them had once worked with on a dinner cruise, he agreed to attend without much thought. He wore a leather jacket, even though it was still a little too warm to wear comfortably in early December. He liked the jacket, picked out of a box of free clothes left behind in the lobby of someone he had once hooked up with. Paolo was disappointed in himself for not saying anything to Colin while they were both at the party. They even waited in the same line for the bathroom. Having felt invisible most of his life, Paolo thought of himself as impervious to embarrassment. Shyness was simply not him. And yet, despite his easygoing nature, something in Colin made him feel like he needed reassurance before stepping outside the safety of himself. Colin didn't think of himself as inaccessible, but he knew he could be reserved. Not like the moon in its cold distance, but the sun, the bright spot that keeps everyone tethered to it. Long after the relationship had come and gone, Paolo would always recall how this boyfriend had made him a little nervous at first. After years of feeling neglected, Colin seemed to Paolo like an impossible grand prize, a tall, handsome trophy of a man who shone too brightly and couldn't possibly have been for Paolo to keep. So, do you wanna? Only if you want to. If you want to, then yeah. You good? I have a little sugar and these little tarts, blackberry and currant. I can't believe they've already made a documentary about the executions. Colin realized Paolo wanted to talk about the documentary they had tried watching the night before, the one Paolo had wept through. The documentary, A View from All Sides, follows the history of ARGOs, also known as aeronautic relay gyroscopes, and the various ways in which they've been implemented in the past 60 years. Designed by a man named Orville Obersteiner, the ARGOs were first used to relay information to the farthest reaches of rapidly expanding city centers. Outdated infrastructure made most telecommunications an expensive and rare commodity, leaving large urban and suburban communities isolated. Local broadcasting stations without the budget to upkeep their own equipment could rent an ARGO instead. Some were rented by neighborhoods to watch sporting events together, which helped defray the cost. Occasionally, they were used by local councils to remind their constituents of important information, such as when to vote in upcoming elections or where to get vaccinated. When the administration rose to power, ARGOs were quickly co-opted for their own purposes. Here, at the Urban Community Museum, there are catalogs on display full of the unanswered requests submitted by average citizens to rent an ARGO, each one ignored. When the ARGOs did return to circulation, the government privatized the entire fleet, making them unaffordable to the average citizen. At the time, no one knew what the administration planned to do with them. For months, the ARGOs drifted aimlessly, their dark screens looming ominously. Soon, the administration began to use the ARGOs to televise executions in an effort to intimidate. Initially, the executions on display were recordings from long before the administration came into power, in an attempt to show they were more civilized than their predecessors. Inevitably, new executions began, projected for everyone to see as a warning. Often these executions were of persons the administration deemed dangerous or uncooperative with their new vision of the world. Very little documentation of these individuals exists beyond the televised executions themselves. As a form of quiet resistance, a photo began circulating of an ARGO struck by lightning during an unexpected thunderstorm. Although the ARGO didn't crash, this image became synonymous with anyone hoping to overthrow their oppressors. It graced album covers, advertisements, clothing brands, anything that would show support for radical change. The administration moved quickly to crack down on use of the image, and it wasn't long before those seen openly flaunting their support began to disappear. Even after that, there were still numerous examples of this image hidden away in the linings of jackets, printed on the insides of books, even as a tattoo. After the fall of the administration, the ARGOs disappeared for a second time. Information was slow to circulate without well-supported news outlets, leaving many communities unaware of the shift in their government. The government that came to replace the administration was inundated with problems and lacked the resources to handle them properly. Despite their oppressive connotations, the ARGOs were once again seen as an opportunity to reunite the shattered communities they were now trying to serve. Many older people who lived through the administration were quick to speak out against their use, but despite these initial protests, the ARGOs were utilized to display simple information like the 7-day weather forecast. Over time, they were expanded to include local events. Some communities allowed families to use them personally, having their ARGO display a birthday greeting for a child or a slideshow of photos taken on their recent vacation. Unsurprisingly, their return to being used solely for public good was short-lived. Faced with the inability to broadcast news about the upcoming trials of key figures within the administration's cabinet, the new government decided to once again use the ARGOs to make examples of citizens seen as a threat to public safety. The backlash was swift and immediate, but the ARGOs stayed visible through each trial and subsequent sentencing. Some people were quick to recognize the poetic justice in condemning the administration's chief media strategist, Megan Johnson, on the very device she championed. Others lamented the ARGOs as a cruel, manipulative tool, regardless of who was using them. The current government hoped for better transparency than their predecessors, but found themselves inevitably following in their footsteps. When the crimes committed were deemed to warrant an execution, the ARGOs once again served their purpose. Community organizers struggled to find a positive use for them that challenged this vicious history, continuing to run birth announcements and fun science facts for local children between passionate courtroom proceedings. But after nearly a year of preceding trials, their use in this way once again began to feel normal. The executions took place over 1 week, each day a different cabinet member. Everyone could agree that what was happening was horrific, but the crimes committed by the administration had already begun to fade, worn smooth and inconsequential by newer, more sensational horrors. This is what Colin and Paolo both remembered about that week. Not the specifics of who had died, but rather that people had died, hovering high up above their heads. Minnie kept Colin indoors that week, shut off from the final words of people she herself barely knew anything about. The administration was of her parents' generation, and besides, Colin's well-being was more important than bearing witness to history her parents hadn't survived long enough to see. Each day at 6 p.m., when that day's convict was led into the execution chamber, Minnie would snip the energy converter in their apartment, which cut off not only electricity, but all broadcasted images from flowing into their home. She made the week into a kind of game, eating dinner together by candlelight as if they were weathering some ferocious storm. Paolo, on the other hand, remembered those days as particularly awful ones. When stressed, his mother would scream without warning, sometimes ear-piercingly loud, other times barely a yelp, and the daily executions, slowed by all-day televised commentary, meant she started well before noon. His father would drink to offset his wife's outbursts, watching each person die as his wife tearfully begged for him to come inside. Avoiding his parents, Paolo was stuck waiting in his room until each execution was over, unable to escape by just leaving as he normally would. He would hide his telecommunicator in the closet, unable to shut off the live feed without cutting energy to the whole house. Even muffled under the dirty clothes in his closet, he could still hear each ragged, protracted breath. Even if he didn't know it at the time, it was in that moment of hearing Paolo describe that week of executions, of realizing Paolo had agreed to see that movie, despite knowing it would be hard for him, that Colin decided he would do everything he could possibly do for Paolo. Which is what he did until he couldn't anymore.